Joining us. I would like to get started here in a minute. I would like to start with a few housekeeping items. We are using the Zoom webinar platform, which allows for a safer participant experience, but does not allow for participants to be on camera or on microphone. So we will be encouraging you to keep engaged in this conversation by joining us by submitting a question. You can do that in the question box down at the bottom of your screen. There'll be a little Q&A button. You can go ahead and click that, and you can submit a question at any time. We will be reviewing your questions as we move through the presentation. There most likely will not be enough time to answer every single one of them, but we will try to get to as many as possible. One way we can do that is by combining very similar questions into one, and that way we can get as many as possible. We would love to keep this conversation going beyond just tonight. You can join us on our respective social media pages and platforms. That's the best way to keep the conversation going. We're going to get started with our program tonight. We are so excited to have this intimate conversation between Eamon O'Byrne and Doug McConnell as our hosts. We are so fortunate to have such great friends like Doug that are here to help introduce Eamon to much of our community. To get started, many of you may know Doug McConnell. He's a TV journalist who with programs that have focused on environmental issues, and they've been on the air continuously since 1982. His work has been recognized by multiple Emmys, an Iris and a Gabriel, and he is currently the host of OpenRoads on NBC. And hopefully you tune in to catch that show. He will be interviewing our executive director at the Sonoma Land Trust, Eamon O'Byrne. He has been our executive director since September of 2019. Since then, in just a few short months, we have put him through his paces. He's faced many challenges, including fires, floods, and now entire global pandemics. So he is going through the ringer. And Doug is here to help introduce Eamon and have a lovely conversation about the future of conservation and Sonoma Land Trust. My name is Neil Ramus. I'm the Director of Community Engagement, and I'll be here to help support them, and I'll be asking questions from the audience at the end. Doug, go ahead and take it away.
Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. I was struggling with the unmute there, so technologically I'm a little bit limited, but it is just great. And Eamon, it is so wonderful literally to see you. I think the last time we saw each other was in the field, filming for one of our OpenRoad shows about how you were preparing for the world of a changing climate. We shot that out of Sonoma Valley Regional Park in the end of February, just before the pandemic hit. So everything is well with you and your wife and your family?
Yes, thank you, Doug. I think, like a lot of us, we've been like a lot of Californians. We listened to the governors and public health officials, and we sheltered in place. And so far, we've been fortunate, you know. And my heart goes out to those folks who've been very impacted by this this pandemic. And I have to say, I'm just so grateful I work in an area where we can help by helping to provide open space, which I think is what's keeping us and a lot of us sane at this moment in time.
Well, I completely agree with that. Literally been my salvation during this tough time for all of us. And we'll talk about the pandemic in a little bit, obviously, and the impact it's had on the land trust and how you're contending with that. And we'll talk about your work on climate change and community engagement and protecting habitats for nature to move and for all of us to be resilient in this changing world we're living in, all kinds of things. But I wanted to start, just somebody you and I both know, and I think so many people who are listening and watching tonight now. This is July 23rd, 2020, an auspicious day because this is the very day that our beloved Dr. Marty Griffin, one of those great rebels with a cause, featured in the KRCB film and many other things, who has spent a lifetime working to protect Marin and Sonoma counties. I live in Marin and I'm up here a lot. Dr. Marty Griffin turns 100 years old today. And so, Marty, if you're watching out here, we love you. We thank you. We celebrate you for all your work at protecting the Bolinas Lagoon and Point Reyes and Richardson Bay and the Russian River and so many other things, and supporting the Land Trust. I think back in 1990, Marty and his wife Joyce donated a 44-acre Russian River Riparian Reserve, the Griffin Riparian Reserve, to the Land Trust as part of the way to protect that wonderful habitat and the life that's there. So Marty, thank you, and Eamon. Before we really get rolling into some other things, let's talk a little bit about you. I mean, you and I actually have known each other. I think I first met you when you were a child, about 20 years ago or so, and you were doing some wonderful work at that time for the San Francisco Maritime National Historic Park, and we met, and then you left, and you went away and had this incredible career with the Nature Conservancy, and focused to a very large extent on doing important work in the Channel Islands, those magnificent islands off the coast of Santa Barbara and Ventura, and in particular, working hard to protect the endangered, highly endangered at that time, island fox. Tell us a little bit about that work.
Well, it was. It's an incredibly special place. I mean, people often refer to the Channel Islands as the Galapagos of North America because of the sheer range of species, California endemic species that are found there. Although, if you talk to the chief scientist that I used to work with at TNC, he'd get quite irritated because he said, well, actually, if you count it up, we actually have more species than the Galapagos do. But the island fox, I think, the recovery of the island fox was an ongoing, multi-year, multifaceted project. And I was fortunate to come in at the final push that for which we got recognized. And I think the lesson we took away from that was that this was an ecosystem on the verge of collapse. It had been so badly damaged from feral sheep and feral pigs and vast numbers of cattle without any kind of sustainable approach. And what really struck me is when we took all those negative influences away from the habitat, we were astonished at nature's ability to just bounce back. And that was one key lesson we learned. And the island has just flowered incredibly since those days. And with the fox, I think it was a classic example that when you pull a very important piece of the ecosystem away, very soon you quickly have cascading effects that show up sometimes months, sometimes years later, that you really have to scramble to fix. In our case, it was the dumping of DDT into the Santa Barbara Channel, which wiped out the bald eagles, which then allowed golden eagles to come in who were looking for the pigs, and pigs being as smart as they are, managed to stay out of the way of the eagles. And then the eagles went straight after the foxes. And a full-grown bald eagle can eat a lot of foxes. So it's an example of how putting things back, nature can really, really recover in ways that are frankly miraculous.
It is so true. I've had the pleasure of going to the Santa Cruz Island a number of times to film and just to be there for my own opportunity to explore. And that story of the restoration of Santa Cruz Island in particular, and the recovery, the fastest recovery from from an animal who's been on the Endangered Species Act was the island fox. When you and your colleagues restored that environment, created more natural systems, the recovery was overwhelming. In fact, you won a big award on that front, didn't you?
Yes, we did. The island team received the Fish and Wildlife Service Conservation Hero Award for 2016 for that work. And you're right, it was the fastest recovery of an endangered mammal in the history of the Endangered Species Act. We managed to turn it around in a space of around about 12 years, I think.
Incredible, incredible. And I just have to say, on top of everything else, they are awfully cute. They're smaller than,
Yes.
they're smaller than foxes. Islands either create smaller animals or larger animals, depending on how the niches they have to fill. But anyway, Eamon, congratulations with that. But now we are so lucky to have you here now, as the executive director of the fabulous Sonoma Land Trust. Wonderful. I want to talk about that in a second. I also want to acknowledge that your wife is with you, and she's holding down a pretty significant job herself. Describe her work.
Well, I'm very happy to have very interesting over the breakfast table conversations about conservation with my wife. She's the executive director of the San Francisco Botanic Garden, known to some people as the Striving Arboretum, as it used to be known, in Golden Gate Park. And that's a wonderful space where they conserve 9,000 different plant species from around the world, some of which are critically endangered, and they preserve and collect them, hopefully at some point to reintroduce them to the wild. As they like to say, see the world in 55 acres.
That's exactly true. It's one of my favorite locations in the region and in Golden Gate Park. A wonderful place to explore, and as you say, around the world, and if not 80 days, then 50 some odd acres. But now you're back, you're in Sonoma, so you're up here, and she's working there, and you guys are falling in love with Sonoma. What's your sense of Sonoma County now that you're really coming in and digging into this place?
Every day, despite all of the global events that have been occurring, has confirmed that I'm so glad to have made the choice to come back for what for me is home. I am forever amazed at the sheer diversity and breadth of wildlife and plant life that this county, which is a home to, over 500,000 people, sharing that space with nature is just something that's very rare to find. And I continue to be amazed at the very deep land ethic that I find all across the community, and all different types of political beliefs. Everyone feels a deep attachment to the land, and that's rare to come across. And I continue to find through our work with the Land Trust these incredible nooks and crannies of, gosh, what California must have looked like 150 years ago, and frankly, what it can look like again if we care for it right.
Well, I agree. I live in Marin, but I speak into Sonoma as often as possible. And the late Ted Elliott, another one of our heroes that we so loved and admired, made the case to me, and interviewing him last year or so ago, before he passed away, that this is the most beautiful county in America. And some may argue with that, but I find it hard to disagree with that. And it's inspiring to see the work that the Land Trust and many other partners over these last 40 years or so have done to really begin to protect, enhance, improve, and create these magnificent landscapes of ours for the health and well-being of nature, and for us and for our communities. So you've come at a time, and for you personally, let me tell you one last question, and then let's get into where things are going for the future here. When did you fall in love with nature? What was your hook? What got you into this? Brought you here to this evening?
Well, I think that what really made it possible for me was growing up about a 2 to 2.5 mile walk from the ocean. And, I grew up in pretty modest circumstances in, a public housing project. And of the time, you can imagine concrete jungle, not a lot of open space, but being able to walk down and see that open space of the ocean and the beaches next to it really kept my horizons open. And it stayed with me over the years as one of the guiding lights of my life and my career, of wanting to make that type of experience available to people who, like me, grow up in modest circumstances, who may not have had the opportunity to experience wilderness, but for whom even that little that moment, that window of, you know, on a weekly basis, being able to walk beside a beach, that led to choices and career choices and a wonderfully interesting career that I want to make sure that other people have that experience, especially the future generations, which will be I think the stewards of our future.
And that's really an important, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more a bit later. That's an important piece of the agenda for the Land Trust, and you're doing some you and your colleagues and supporters are doing extraordinary work to make these landscapes part of everyone's life in new and interesting and really important ways. So I love hearing that story of your beginning, and now you're here, and you know you've taken on the Sonoma Land Trust with this, you know, legacy over the past now 44 years, 54,000 acres of land protected, and that's only part of the legacy here. You've worked in partnership. This is an ecosystem of conservation activity of collaboration up here that I really admire. When you take this over and you've come at the time of, as Neil said earlier, of fires or floods, and now gee whiz, a pandemic. What's your sense of this organization, its legacy, and as you sort of begin to work with the challenges we face, as well as the great legacy you have to carry forward?
Yeah, it has been a pretty challenging time, and I think like all of us, you know, our lives were upended by the pandemic, and like everybody else, we're wrestling with the tremendous uncertainty about the future. But you know, in some ways, you know, we're in some ways fortunate because by definition our work is outside, so we've been able to continue working and advancing our mission, you know, with obviously the working from home issues. But and of course we miss working with one another. One of the things many of us are in conservation is the ability to work creatively together and develop really interesting solutions to challenges, both internally as an organization and across, as you say, the ecosystem of all the different nonprofits working on this issue. But in some ways, I have to say, this is the moment the Land Trust in some ways was born for. You know, fires, floods, pandemics, and the struggle to create a more just and equitable society. I mean, all of these, we fundamentally believe, are problems that are solvable, and that land conservation is a really important component of those solutions. On top of that, the reality is that climate change really hasn't taken a vacation, and without being flippant about it, it has the capacity to seriously dwarf what we're going through right now by orders of magnitude. And I think that this moment in time, we're collectively as a society going through a period where we're starting to realize that we have to do things differently if we're going to thrive as a species. And frankly, that gives me a lot of hope that, you know, we have solutions to bring to the table. Land conservation will be really important about mitigating and adapting to climate change, and access to parks and open spaces is going to be really critical for the physical and mental health of our community in the coming years. And I can tell you, we're poised to act on those solutions.
Well, you have this incredible, as I say, legacy, team, support from the community, broadly speaking, as well as those who are, you know, in the immediate network of the Land Trust. So I have a lot of confidence in your capacities to do all of this. And I've also been really struck by, this is sort of, the pandemic is sort of the fire drill. This is sort of the red alert warning, and that we can't ignore nature. We have to work with nature. That the health of, seems to me, and maybe what I'm hearing you say, is that the health of nature, the health of us as individuals, the health of our communities, and the health of future generations are all indivisible. They're intertwined. Absolutely. And they're one. And you're at the front lines of that.
That's absolutely true, Doug. Because if we think about it, you know, just thinking about climate change off the top of our minds, I mean, we've in Sonoma County already gone through so much trauma from the recent wildfires. And we are beginning to really feel the leading edge of what climate change can really mean for us collectively as a society. So we've been working closely with CAL FIRE and other nonprofits in the area to create what we call the Sonoma Valley Wildlands Collaborative. And that's a collaborative that is working across 18,000 acres of public lands to do all kinds of really important fire management work. So for example, we're doing ecologically appropriate thinning in forests and woodlands. There's a lot of unhealthy growth there because we've suppressed fire instead of allowing it to flow through the landscape naturally as the Native Americans did. And so there's appropriate thinning that we can do to improve the ecology and reduce fuel loads. We're doing a lot to reduce the ladder fuels that push fires up into the crowns of forested lands and that magnify by orders of magnitude the severity and the difficulty of reacting to these fires. We're installing shaded fuel breaks near safety targets. And what that means, essentially, we're trying to push any fires back down to the ground so that firefighters are really able to get a handle on those fires, and especially near communities and structures. And then we're also doing things like clearing along roadways and along rights of way so that emergency personnel have a really clear tactical area of operations to get to and anchor their firefighting operations. And then of course, one of the key tools that we have to promote forest health and resilience is of course the one that again the Native American members of our community have been practicing for millennia, and that's controlled burns. So bringing fire back in the manageable, normal, ecologically sound ways that it's always been a part of our habitats. And so,
go ahead.
And so, you know, I think that we by doing things like this, it's not just about restoring a habitat, and it's not just about improving an ecology. It's also reducing risk for our communities and bringing us to a place where we can live with fire as we did in the past.
Yeah, well, I've been following those elements that you just talked about and the work you're doing in the Valley in this collaborative effort, again, with so many, you know, with CAL FIRE and your participating organizations, and really bringing wisdom of the past, bringing Native American wisdom, indigenous wisdom that we so for too long ignored, for too long back and incorporating it in our lives, just as we need to do that culturally, to take that wisdom and apply it to the land as part of your toolkit is really important. And as you say, climate change isn't, you know, taking a vacation. So longer, hotter, you know, fire seasons, you know, there's no time like the present, obviously, and you guys are moving forward. But you're also, with regard to climate change, doing some big work with regard to sea level rise, which is a tremendous potential threat. And the San Pablo Bay Baylands project you're working on, again with others. Talk about that project.
Well, this is something that we've been engaged in now for a number of decades, and it comes out of the realization, which is pretty startling, that as tragic and as painful as the recent fires have been, again, they are nowhere near the potential magnitude that sea level rise and flooding, the damage that sea level rise and flooding can cause. Recent estimates suggest that, in fact, flooding and sea level rise could potentially cause more damage than earthquakes and wildfires combined. So planners in the state are pretty worried about this. And as you say, Doug, I mean, the changes in our climate that are occurring, where we're having longer, drier, and hotter fire seasons, is also going to be matched by shorter but much more intense rainfall seasons. And that's going to create real problems Again, because a lot of that precipitation won't fall as snow, it will fall as rain, and it will flood, come right down the Sacramento River, and the first thing it will hit is San Francisco Bay. When you combine that with the predicted rise of anywhere between 2 and 7 feet in the next 100 years, you're talking about a perfect storm of really serious damage to a lot of territory, not just that areas like the habitats which exist down there, but also the towns and cities that exist along the historic edge of the bay, including places like Petaluma and the town of Sonoma itself. So what we've been engaged in San Pablo Bay is working to restore former grass farms, hay farms, into their original character as wetlands. And we've been pretty successful in that work, helping to bring back the normal flow of silt and water that over time eventually creates the wetland habitat, which is home to many thousands of plants and animals. A lot of people realize that California is the first stop on the Pacific Flyway, which is one of the most important migratory routes in the world. And it's an area where it is so important for those birds to find an area to rest, to feed on their long journey. And a lot of the wetlands of San Francisco Bay have completely disappeared. Well over 90% of them have disappeared in the last 100 years by infill. So our effort to restore them has the potential to be well over 10,000 acres of pretty pristine and prime wetland habitat. But there's more to it than that, because the other thing we realize is that what we call natural infrastructure solutions, this is natural ways to adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change. Wetlands absorb vast quantities of water and they release them very slowly, just like a sponge. And so warding off the impacts of sea level rise, I mean, we could build huge structures of seawalls and what we call armoring, but the cost would be almost unbearable. And there's no real guarantee that that sort of infrastructure would last. Whereas we know that restoring wetlands does just as good a job and is actually cheaper and more effective over the long run. And this isn't some hypothetical, as many of us in Sonoma County realize, because Highway 37 has been flooded on a number of occasions, most recently in the winter of 2018, where the roads were impassable for days on end. This is a critical economic artery for this region, from Solano through to Marin, and it's a very important way that many workers are able to access their jobs, as well as a point of entry for the tourism industry. And so this is not a hypothetical for us. We know that the Highway 37 and frankly Caltrans have been very much inviting us into the conversation around planning to create an elevated highway that is then protected by a vast stretch of wetland buffering that human infrastructure, as well as creating 10,000 acres of habitat for nature. So it's a win for people and it's a win for nature at the same time. And those are the kinds of solutions that we're working on for the future.
Well, and again, just as using a controlled prescribed burns can, and then taking the knowledge of indigenous people for thousands of years and applying it in the 21st century can lead to good outcomes. So can investing in the wisdom of nature at the water's edge be the wisest engineering maneuver we can do, which is, as you say, that green infrastructure, that natural infrastructure that also creates, it really takes us back to the future in a way, back to a time before the gold rush, if we'd come along to San Pablo Bay and gone up to Petaluma, and I mean these vast wetland complexes filled with nature. We can regain least a large part of that and do ourselves good here as we face the changing world of the 21st century.
It's true. It's so true, Doug. I mean, it's just, I think what really strikes me is that, you know, we tend to think about nature as being a victim of climate change, when really we should be thinking about nature as a solution for climate change. And I think that's borne out by the work in the wetlands so well.
I think that's nicely said. And I was just going to say, because I mentioned Petaluma, you're really working on some resilience issues for Petaluma upstream in the Petaluma River, yes?
Yeah, the Petaluma River, it's really a tidal slough to the experts. It passes through some of the most ancient original wetland habitat that exists in the San Francisco Bay region. And it's extremely important because if that goes away, then we will have lost one of the most unique habitats left in the Bay Area. We're also concerned about the impacts of sea level rise, as I've said, in the southern reaches of Petaluma, the city of Petaluma itself. I mean, I know it's hard to imagine for many people as they drive along Highway 101 and they see that Petaluma seems to be a long way from San Francisco Bay. But what a lot of people don't realize is that where Petaluma is today is right where the bay was 150 years ago. And the ocean hasn't forgotten and really wants to go back there and will go back there with sea level rise. So we have to come up with creative solutions both to protect that wetland and make sure that the city of Petaluma stays healthy and dry.
And you're also doing some work, I think, on a little note here on Sonoma Creek. Yes, for you have a strategy for that as well. I'm less familiar with your work there. What's that about?
Well, Sonoma Creek refers to the work that we are doing both to connect the uplands, what we technically call the uplands, the hills, the forests, which depend on healthy river systems, with the lowlands, the wetland areas. And Sonoma Creek's an interesting case because when you combine severe atmospheric rivers on one hand, you know, intense rainfall events that will swell the creek to flood proportions, with king tides and sea level rise at the other end of the system in the San Pablo Baylands, and you're talking about a vast area that is subject to pretty catastrophic flooding. So we're working through the Sonoma Creek to connect each of the discrete parts of that wetland habitat and reconnect them in ways that they have not been connected in 150 years. And so the Sonoma Creek strategy is really about restoring natural water flow and the migration of those wetlands back to where they were before.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of this work that you're doing. It all relates to climate change, but also ecological resilience. And you're working in the Russian River watershed, that obviously this big chunk of Sonoma County that's water supply, recreational location for so many of us, as well as profound, rich environmental habitat. What are you doing? What are you doing in the Russian River watershed?
Well, the Russian River, as I think everyone would agree, is a very big, complicated system, and it has lots of different stakeholders and advocates. And it's a system that's been subject to a lot of changes in a lot of ways over the last 150 years. And so restoring this watershed won't be simple or quick. But the science is pretty clear that one of the best ways to help restore the overall health of the river is to improve salmon habitat, which in turn has all kinds of cascading levels of benefit for the plants and animals that depend on this watershed. And so we are focusing on one area that we think will be important to all the other restoration areas. And that's improving the number and the quality of places that salmon young can mature to the point that they're ready to return to the ocean. Right now, because of human impacts, there just isn't enough of these places, relatively deep, cool, and still sections of the river. A lot of the river is less hospitable to salmon because we've either taken or diverted water, or longer and hotter and drier and winters have not released enough water into the system. And so it's also because when we do get that water, we get a lot of it very quickly, which tends to gouge the river and create channeling, which then speeds up the relative speed of the water flow and actually tire and exhaust the salmon young trying to mature enough to be able to get back downriver. So with our partners, we've been conducting painstaking scientific surveys of the river's tributaries to identify reaches that could provide the right conditions. And then with some restoration, that would provide a lot of the alternative habitat that they need and hopefully put more water back into the system. So that's a very targeted, scientifically driven way that we think can help buy time and help enhance and grow and improve the broad range of restoration efforts taking place across this most important river system, and for an iconic species for Sonoma County.
Absolutely. And looking more broadly, I'm very aware of your efforts to protect big interconnected landscapes from wildlife movement terrestrially, and of course up and down the watersheds. The Jenner headlands and other areas where you really created, with other partners, really created these big landscapes and letting nature kind of become the, determine how that land manages itself in a certain way. But I had a great joy of spending a couple of days filming, first exploring and then filming up on the McCormick Ranch. This is one that I know it's a property that you're closing in on. I hope you're going to be able to purchase this. I want to hear about it. McCormick Ranch is at the summit of the Mayacamas or Mayacamas Mountains, however you want to pronounce that up here. Between the Napa and Sonoma valleys, and it's a historic ranch. It's a big property. It has tremendous potential. And Eamon, just sort of paint a picture of that.
You're right, Doug. It is a one-of-a-kind place, and it's in it's right at the heart of the Mayacamas. I think Sonomans fall into Sonomans are divided into two camps. It's not political and it's not anything else. It's people who say Mayacamas and people who say Mayacamas. I'm going to go with Mayacamas.
Okay.
McCormick Ranch is, first of all, a place where three different headwaters that provide drinking water to Sonoma County, that's where they start. So, we're thinking about water quality and water security on top of everything else. But the Mayacamas themselves, as many people know, are part of what we call the Blue Ridge wildlife linkage that runs all the way up into Mendocino County and connects even further into the north part of the state. And long, big stretches of habitat and linkages are really important for fostering biodiversity because they give animals and frankly plants room to move, both to forage and to feed and to mate. When we develop, we tend to cut up landscapes, which then confine species to areas where they can't really spread their genetic and continue to augment their genetic diversity. And that ultimately is a slow road to extinction. So having these linkages is really key. And the Mayacamas are a very important linkage to connect that stretch of eastern Sonoma County across Sonoma Valley to the open spaces of Marin County. And again, creating large and geographically diverse areas for all kinds of species, from bears to badgers to mountain lions, to forage and roam and stay healthy. But it's also, not coincidentally, a very important part of the Bay Area Ridge Trail. And it's going to be a really important connector for that wonderful trail system for people to hike in, you know, what I think is pretty close to wilderness, only an hour from civilization. And, you know, ultimately, the work that we're doing there has long-term effects and consequences. I mean, we've been talking a lot about the pandemic and the impacts it has on our lives. And I think a lot of people don't realize that much of the pandemic, many of the diseases that we're struggling with in the world today, whether it's HIV or whether it's Ebola or whether coronavirus, are what we call zoonotic diseases, diseases that jump from animals to humans. And in our case, albeit one that in some ways seems more of a nuisance than a serious health risk, although will increase with climate change, is the fact that Sonoma County is ground zero in California for Lyme disease. And we know that the incidence of tick-borne infections are rising, and that scientists are beginning to realize that ticks transmit a lot more and a lot worse diseases than Lyme. And chopping up habitat is directly linked to the increasing incidence of the transmission of these diseases. So one of the key linkages, I think, in my mind is the more biodiversity you have, the more linkages you have, the more you suppress these kinds of health risks for our communities. So there's a real connection there.
Yep, well, it's a real point. Again, we've always been talking about throughout this, the health of nature, the health of our communities, and our health are just intertwined. And we can, if everybody's healthy, we're all healthy, but we're part of an ecosystem of health and well-being. We have time. We're going to have some questions coming up really soon, but we've got time for one more topic here real briefly, but I know it's a really important one. It goes back to what you talked about early on when you talked about yourself, being a little kid, you know, who didn't have much access to nature except a path to the ocean. Community engagement for the Sonoma Land Trust is always important, hard to do during this pandemic. You can't lead the tours. It's hard to, you know, with social distancing and that sort of thing. But you're still working really diligently on this. And as a part of that, just talk a little bit about the equity part, the social equity, the importance of engaging all of us in the community, all of us who care, all of us who are, you know, supporters, who might be supporters, but also that next generation of very diverse Sonoma County young people.
I think this is one of the most important tasks that we have acknowledged that we need to take on in not just the Sonoma Land Trust, but across the environmental movement as a whole. Because, you know, the truth is, historically, we've not been a welcoming place for many of the communities that don't conform to the traditional middle-class white cohort of our society. And when we think about the tremendous energy that grew up around Earth Day 1970 and how everyone was incredibly enthused about where we were headed ecologically and how that somehow seemed to fade over the years, I think there's a direct linkage between that and our failure to really connect with the broad diversity of audiences and supporters that are out there. I think that's one piece of it. The other piece of it that I think is important to acknowledge is there is one of the key indicators of overall community health is adjacency to or an access to large swaths of open space. And we know that the science is there that tells us that one of the best ways and one of the quickest ways to really improve community health outcomes is to make places where people can run, walk, bike, hike, and exercise available to those communities. And it's also an equity issue in terms of health outcomes, in terms of, for example, a recent study showed that African-American mothers suffered on average, higher incidences of lower birth weights and pregnancy problems as a result of things like pollution, being forced to live in communities that had little access to clean air, and very importantly, no access to the buffering effects of parks in terms of heat. There's a real correlation to heat and fetus health. And we know that large swaths of open space inside the urban core reduce the effects of high heat days. And then there's, as we've talked about earlier, the fact that that big open space also is a big sponge for flooding events, which is especially destructive again in the urban core. And we also recognize the fact that, you know, especially with the pandemic currently going on, our Latino neighbors and community members are suffering disproportionately higher impacts from the coronavirus. And we feel it's really incumbent on us to do all that we can to work closely with our partners in those communities, both to bring kids into nature and forge those connections, and provide them with the tools and the empowerment to go ahead and create their own spaces within the wonderful parks and open spaces and the nature that surrounds us in the county.
So I know this has been a really important, high priority agenda item. All of these points you're making to connect with the community, to engage with the community, and make it landscapes for all, forever, for every single person, for all of us, and to create that next generation of young people who will be taking over from us, the way some of us have been sort of trying to follow in Marty Griffin's footsteps, among other things. And real quickly, one point I did want to make, and maybe we can come up on the questions, is it appears as if Donald Trump signs it here. It's passed both houses of Congress. The Great American Outdoors Act can bring some real money to the table here, right here in Sonoma County, for you and your partners to really make a difference on some of these and other issues.
It's been a wonderful victory for the conservation movement. And I think one of the things, it's not just the fact that Congress for the first time has permanently funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which, by the way, many projects all across Sonoma County have benefited from in the last 50 years. Not only is the Land and Water Conservation Fund fully funded now and permanently funded, but it was a completely bipartisan approach. And that really gives me a lot of hope that we can get beyond our political differences and recognize the essential, fundamental importance of nature for the health of our nation and for our economy and for all of our people.
This is one of the biggest investments in our natural world and in organizations like the Land Trust and others here in Sonoma to really make a difference on the ground in people's lives. And you've got some exciting plans with maybe some money coming your way, yes?
We certainly do. I mean, we've certainly got some wonderful projects, like, for example, the Sonoma Greenway, the Southeast Greenway, part of our community conservation portfolio of work, where we're trying to open up wonderful jewels like Taylor Mountain and Ana del Triona National State Park to be able to be reachable by pedestrian or bike access through the conversion of what was supposed to be a Caltrans Highway 12 off-ramp into a wonderful connector greenway between this wonderful necklace of parks surrounding Sonoma, and opening up park space for a part of Santa Rosa that hasn't necessarily had good access to parks. So that's a really exciting project. And of course, the Baylands work that we're doing is a really great candidate for some of that LCWF funding. So we're excited.
You're excited. You've got a lot going on, and if there are questions are coming soon, I think here. But Eamon, one last question I've got for you. Of course, I can keep asking you questions all night long and listening. For you personally, what's really kind of if you were to sort of say that the aspect of all this that is really powering you forward right now in these tough times we're all dealing with the challenges, but the potential opportunities to really make a difference, to turn darkness into light. How would you summarize your sort of your focus and your agenda right now?
So in many ways, what's really powering us forward is how sharply defined our mission has become in the last 3 months. It's about not just seeing nature, and I think this is true for everybody. I think there's a general realization that both for us inside conservation and for the communities we hope to serve, that nature isn't just a nice to have. It is an essential need for our world and for our society. And it's in some ways, deserves and must have the same level of attention that a public utility like water or power or roads must have in order for us to move forward as a society. And I'm also heartened by the fact that I look around the parks that I've been recreating in the last 3 months and seen, a welcome upswing of park usage and a much broader swath of types of park users, bikers, families, skateboarders, all different kinds of people recognizing that fundamental connection to nature in ways that, in the past haven't always been available to them. And I think there's a renewed desire for collective action, for the collective good. And the locus for that is around nature, which is something we all share. And so moving forward, the portfolio of work that we're really pushing forward is that body of work that can help Sonoma adapt to climate change, protect the diversity of plants and animals that call this wonderful county home, and then make sure that those spaces are available to each and every Sonoman, regardless of socioeconomic status, so that they can thrive and realize their potential as human beings and as members of our community. So that's really what's driving us forward. And McCormick Ranch is the big project that we're pushing to complete at the end of this year. We're almost there, and we're going to need a little bit of help. But before I talk about that, we'll probably go to some questions.
Looks like Neil is here.
I'm here to interrupt this amazing conversation. I'm sorry, but I wanted to bring you some live questions from our audience. They have some great questions from the specific to the big. So we are going to start with something big. Climate change. It's a huge problem. Can you talk about how SLT's Sonoma Land Trust work offers lessons for conservation nationally?
Yes, that's a great question. So one of the things that we've done at the Sonoma, there's a couple of areas in which we're being recognized nationally. The first is in our community engagement. I think many folks may be aware that we were one of the early adopters of the California Council of Land Trusts' efforts to broaden and diversify conservation supporters and audiences. And we published our diversity, equity, and inclusion plan back in last year. And we were nationally recognized for those efforts at the national organization level, the Land Trust Alliance. And we've been sharing what we've learned about how you go about really changing the composition of your focus to be more open to broader audiences with many land trusts throughout the nation. From a conservation perspective, we've just finished a collaboration with the Nature Conservancy to publish a practitioner's guide for water use. And this is a really effective, scientifically based guide for water analysis and planning for conservation work. And that's being shared throughout California, and it's available on our website. And it's designed for practitioners, but if you're interested, it's something that I think many folks would find interesting. So we're influencing conservation both here locally and across the country.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out for those that are not as ecologically versed, there's an executive summary that is much shorter than the original report. You should check that out. Question about collaboration. You talked the national question, so let's bring it down a little bit more locally. Sonoma Land Trust has a long history of partnerships with regional parks and other public land managers. What projects has Sonoma Land Trust been working on to expand protected lands that improve landscape resiliency while also expanding access for the community?
You know, that is a real testament to the fact that I think, as we all realize, none of the entities working in conservation really ever accomplish any of this work alone. And we are a very complex and interdependent ecosystem. We've both partners in regional parks, Sonoma County regional parks, and in the agricultural and open space district. And between the three of us, we create a wonderful partnership that does 360-degree scan of all the available habitats and opportunities and funding opportunities. And between the three of us are able to create this really powerful engine for expanding our open space. Among recent examples, for example, I'll keep talking about McCormick Ranch. That's a 640-acre addition to Hood Mountain Sugarloaf State Park, Hood Mountain Regional Park, Sugarloaf State Park, so that we can, for the first time, connect those two parks in a really meaningful way and create an important linkage for the Bay Area Ridge Trail. We've also, as many of you may be aware, one of our biggest projects, the Jenner Headlands, that was a collaboration with many local partners and 5,000 acres of pristine coastal habitat that's now available for public access. And there's many, I could talk for hours and hours about the many projects. North Sonoma Mountain Regional Park we helped to bring about. So there's a whole list of those things that we've been doing, and often probably a little too quietly in the background, but helping to make Sonoma a really wonderful place to live.
Thank you. And bringing it even more locally to this particular organization, Sonoma Land Trust, a question: how is your organization, Sonoma Land Trust, managing the economic uncertainty that we are all facing around coronavirus?
Yeah.
Not a softball question, I know, I'm sorry.
Easy question.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's no surprise to anyone that the economic consequences of coronavirus are hitting us every bit as hard as all of the many businesses and economic entities within the county. For us, that shows up in the dramatic shortfall that's now shown up in the state and local county budgets, and the gaps that they now have to fill, and the resources that they had set aside for conservation now have to be devoted to shoring up those gaps. So we are now more than ever incredibly dependent on the generosity of private individuals to help advance our work in the coming years. And we are fortunate to have a very generous and very conservation-minded community here, and we're going to ask a lot from them over the coming months and years. And so there's lots of ways to give. You can go on our website and log in at sonomalandtrust.org, and you can give on our website. Any amount helps us, and as you know, every dollar will be showing up in helping to continue to advance our work on mitigating climate change and making open space more accessible, and hopefully bringing back that engine of our economy, which is in many respects the tourism that we depend on.
And thank you. I was going to thank you both, but instead I'm going to read this lovely comment submitted by one of our attendees. I want to thank you both for your sincere devotion to preserving these lands. During this pandemic, my husband and I hiked, walked, explored all over San Francisco and Bay Area trails. They have a home in northern Sonoma County, so they are hiking all over from Lake Sonoma, Armstrong Grove, to Russian River, Sonoma Coast, and many other beautiful open spaces. We have a real appreciation for these areas, and I just wanted to thank you for your good work. So I'll leave it at that, from lovely words from one of our participants. And thank you, Eamon O'Byrne and Doug McConnell, for your time today. I'd also like to thank everyone in attendance tonight for your dedication and your commitment and support of the Sonoma Land Trust. As Eamon pointed out, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we are dependent on the generosity of our supporters. You can feel free to get engaged with us by signing up for our newsletter, joining us on social media, or going to our website and clicking that donate button. That is acceptable as well. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for spending your evening with us. Have a good night, everyone.